The moment Korea's most powerful billionaire reached for the pen that would decide his family's future, three little boys burst through the doors of his mansion. Grandpa,
Grandpa, please don't sign it.
The room exploded into chaos. No one had ever seen these children before, yet they looked at the cold old man as though they had known him all their lives. Then the oldest stepped forward and uttered the words no one in that room was prepared to hear. "We are your grandsons." Nobody believed them. But something about their eyes, something about the way they carried themselves, reminded the billionaire of the son he hadn't seen in years. He cleared the room, leaving only the three boys behind. Then he asked the one question he never imagined would change his life forever. "Where is your father? Why did he send children instead of coming himself?" Ethan lowered his head. "He didn't send us," he whispered. "He died. 5 years ago." The old man's world shattered. 5 years, he repeated, barely able to breathe. "My son has been gone for 5 years, and I never knew." But that heartbreaking revelation raised an even bigger question. Why had his own son hidden his wife and children from everyone? And how had one of Korea's most powerful men lived for 5 years without knowing his own son was gone? The answers the boys gave would expose decades of pride, sacrifice, and family secrets. If you want to discover those answers, and how 3 children reunited a broken family, stay with me until the very end. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and support my channel. The morning Elizabeth met him, the sky over Jeju was the color of a fresh bruise turning gold. She had her basket of clams balanced against her hip, her hair loose and threaded with small white flowers she had picked on her way down the hill. She did not see the man sitting on the rocks until she nearly stepped on his shadow. "You are going to scare the fish away standing there like a crow," she said, not even looking at him properly. He laughed, surprised. Nobody spoke to him like that, not in years. "I did not know fish were afraid of quiet men," he said. "Everything alive is afraid of something," she answered, and walked past him toward the water, her dress catching wind, her feet leaving small prints that the sea erased almost as fast as she made them. He did not know her name that day. He only knew he wanted to hear her laugh again, the kind that came from her stomach and shook her shoulders, the kind that made strangers turn and smile without knowing why. His name was Kang Jae-min, though on the island he called himself Min, nothing more. He wore a plain jacket that had grease stains on the sleeve, borrowed boots 2 sizes too big, and he spent his mornings pretending to mend nets he did not know how to fix. Elizabeth caught him once, tangled hopelessly in rope, cursing under his breath. "You are doing it wrong," she said, crouching beside him without asking. Her hands moved fast, sure, patient, until the net came loose and untangled itself under her fingers like it had been waiting for her the whole time. "Teach me," he said. "Why would I do that?" "Because I will keep failing until you do, and you will keep watching me fail, and eventually you will feel sorry for me." She looked at him properly then, maybe for the first time. There was something in his eyes that did not match his clothes. A stillness, a weight he carried the way rich men carry burdens, quietly, expensively, as though even his pain had been tailored. She did not know yet what she was looking at. Days passed like that, small and stubborn. He came to the shore every morning. She pretended not to wait for him, and he pretended not to notice that she always left one fish on the drying rack facing his direction, as if it were a signal only the 2 of them understood. The village women teased her about it, calling him the boy who could not tie a knot to save his life. Elizabeth laughed along, but at night, lying under a thin blanket listening to the waves, she found herself thinking of his voice, low and careful, and the way he listened to her, the way most men never bothered to. One evening, the wind turned rough, and the waves climbed higher than usual. Elizabeth's boat drifted loose from its rope, and before anyone could shout a warning, Jae-min was already in the water, swimming after it with more strength than his soft hands should have allowed. He dragged the boat back to shore, soaked, breathless, his borrowed boots long gone, lost somewhere in the tide. "You could have drowned," Elizabeth said, her voice sharp with something that was not quite anger. "I did not want you to lose it," he said simply. She wrapped a dry cloth around his shoulders without thinking, and for a moment, Neither of them said anything. The waves calmed as if embarrassed by their earlier violence. His eyes held hers a second too long, and something in her chest tightened, unfamiliar, frightening, alive. "You confuse me," she whispered. "Good," he said. "Confusion means you are paying attention." She pulled away first, laughing to hide the way her hands trembled, and walked home without looking back, though she wanted to. That night, she sat by her window long after her mother had gone to sleep, staring at the moon on the water and asking herself why a stranger with nothing had managed to make her feel like she had everything. A few weeks later, he brought her to a small house on the edge of the village, freshly painted, curtains already hung, as though it had been waiting for a family to arrive. "Whose house is this?" she asked. "Ours," he said. She stepped back immediately, her face hardening. "I do not take charity from strangers." "I am not a stranger. I do not even know your real name." He hesitated only a second before answering. "Kang Jae-min." The name meant nothing to her at first. Not until he added, quietly, almost embarrassed, that his family owned more buildings in Seoul than she had seen in her entire life. She stared at him, waiting for the joke, and when none came, she laughed so hard she had to sit down on the ground, clutching her side, tears streaming down her face. "You!" she gasped between breaths, "pretending to be poor, tangled in nets, losing your boots in the ocean." "It is true," he said, smiling despite himself. "You nearly cracked my ribs with that lie." "It is not a lie." She wiped her eyes, still catching her breath, and looked at him with something new in her expression, something careful. "Why would a man like that pretend to be nothing?" "Because I wanted someone to love the nothing first," he said, before she found out about the everything. The laughter died slowly on her lips. She looked at the house behind him, small, plain, chosen carefully to not overwhelm her, and understood, for the first time, the size of what he was offering. She ran. Not far, only to the shore, where she sat with her knees pulled to her chest and watched the water she trusted more than any man. He did not follow immediately. He gave her the night, and the next morning, and the one after that, until she came to him instead, her eyes red, but her spine straight. "Tell me why you left," she said. "My father wanted me to marry a woman I had never spoken to, for a merger, for shares, for numbers on paper. I told him I would not repeat his mistake." "What mistake?" "My mother was his mistress, not his wife. He never loved her the way a man should love someone he chooses. I watched what that silence did to her until the day she died. I promised myself I would never build a family on a foundation like that." Elizabeth listened, quiet, the wind pulling strands of her hair loose. "So you ran to an island and lied to a fisherwoman?" "I ran to an island and found the truth," he said. "You were never the lie, Elizabeth. I was hiding, not deceiving." She did not answer him that day, but she stopped avoiding him. Slowly, carefully, she let him back into the small spaces of her life. One shared meal, one shared walk, one shared silence at a time, until the ache in her chest turned into something warmer, something she no longer wanted to run from. Word traveled slowly through the village that the quiet stranger had gone back to the city for a few days. Elizabeth told herself she did not care. She caught herself twice glancing toward the road anyway, and scolded herself both times. When he returned, he brought nothing expensive, only a small paper bag of roasted chestnuts, still warm. It was such a plain gift that it undid her completely. She realized then that whatever this man had, whatever name his family carried, he had learned, somewhere along the way, exactly what she needed, and it was never the mansion. They married quietly, away from cameras, away from boardrooms, away from a father who did not yet know his youngest son had chosen a woman with skin the color of rich soil and a laugh that could calm a storm. Jae-min kept his promise. He gave her comfort, safety, a home far from the reach of a family who had never learned how to love without conditions. 3 years later, Elizabeth gave birth to triplets, 3 boys with their father's sharp eyes and their mother's warm skin, born within minutes of each other, screaming loud enough to wake the whole hospital wing. Jae-min held them one by one, his hands shaking, tears sliding down a face that had trained itself for years never to cry. "Ethan," he whispered to the first, "Micah," to the second, "Noah," to the last. He looked up at Elizabeth, exhausted and glowing on the hospital bed, and said the only thing that made sense in that moment. "They will never know what it feels like to be hidden the way I was hidden. They will only know they are loved." He kept that promise for 4 years. The boys grew fast, curious, sharp-tongued in the way children raised by clever parents often are. They teased their father mercilessly, hiding his shoes, swapping the sugar with salt, laughing until they could not breathe when he pretended to be furious. Jae-min adored them with a ferocity that frightened him sometimes, because loving something that much meant there was that much more to lose. He never told them about his father directly. He only said, once, quietly, while tucking Noah into bed, that somewhere far away he had a father who was not a bad man, only a broken one, and broken men sometimes hurt the people closest to them without meaning to. "Will we ever meet him?" Noah had asked, half asleep. "Maybe," Jae-min said, "when the time is right." The time never came. He died suddenly, quietly, without warning, the kind of death that leaves no room for goodbye. Elizabeth remembered every detail of that morning with a clarity that never faded. The phone ringing too early, Dembe's voice cracking on the other end, the sound of her own scream that did not feel like it came from her body. She dropped the phone. She did not remember picking it back up. She only remembered sliding down the kitchen wall until she was sitting on the cold floor, her knees pulled to her chest, exactly the way she used to sit on the shore of Jeju, except now there was no one coming to sit beside her. The boys were at school when it happened. Dembe was the one who drove to collect them, his face unreadable, his hands steady on the wheel, though his knuckles had gone white. He told them in the car, softly, choosing each word like it might break something if he said it wrong. Ethan asked him to repeat it twice, as if hearing it again would change the answer. Micah stared out the window and said nothing at all. Noah simply began to cry, quiet at first, then louder, until the sound filled the whole car. The burial was small, private, hidden the way his entire family life had been hidden. Elizabeth stood at the graveside in black, her hand gripping Dembe's arm so tightly her knuckles turned pale, her 3 sons pressed against her sides, too young to fully understand why the ground was swallowing their father, only understanding that he was not coming back up. Ethan was the first to break. He was always the one who felt things loudest. He threw himself at the fresh earth, small fists pounding the dirt, screaming for his father to wake up, to stop playing, to come home. Micah stood frozen, silent tears sliding down his cheeks without a single sound, his small hands clenched at his sides, as though holding himself together by force. Noah clung to his mother's leg, his face buried in her skirt, refusing to look at the grave at all, as if not looking could undo what was happening. Dembe carried Ethan away from the dirt gently, murmuring something low and steady, the kind of voice used to calm animals and grieving children. Elizabeth did not move for a long time. She stood there long after the small gathering left, long after the sky darkened, staring at the mound of earth that now held every promise her husband had ever made her. "I do not know how to do this without him," she whispered to no one. Dembe returned quietly and stood beside her, his large frame a wall against a wind that had nothing to do with the weather. "You do not have to do it without me," he said. "He asked me once, if anything ever happened to him, to make sure you and the boys never walked alone. I intend to keep that promise until I have no breath left to keep it." She did not answer. She only nodded and let him lead her home. The weeks that followed were the cruelest kind of quiet. The house still smelled like him for a while, his cologne clinging to the pillows, his reading glasses still resting on the side table where he had left them the last morning he was alive. Elizabeth could not bring herself to move them. The hardest moments came without warning. A door would creak open downstairs, and one of the boys, usually Noah, would sprint toward the sound screaming, "Daddy!" his small feet pounding down the hallway, his face lit with a hope so pure it made Elizabeth's chest cave in. It was never him. It was Dembe, standing in the doorway with grocery bags or a bundle of firewood, his face falling every time he saw the light drain out of the child's eyes as the memory caught up to the hope. Noah would stop mid-run, his small body deflating, his lip trembling before the sobs came, loud and broken, the kind of crying that made grown men look away because they did not know how to fix it. It happened again 2 days later, and again after that. Each time, Demby stood still and let the boy cry against his legs, never once telling him to stop, never once saying it would be easier the next time, because he knew it would not be. Ethan took to sitting by the window some evenings, watching the road, saying nothing, waiting for a car that was never going to come. Micah stopped speaking almost entirely for nearly 2 weeks, communicating only through nods and small gestures, his silence louder than any scream. Elizabeth would find him sometimes standing in his father's study, simply staring at the empty chair, as though if he stared long enough, the shape of his father might return to fill it. Elizabeth held them through it, night after night, sometimes all three crammed into her bed, small bodies tangled together, seeking warmth and safety that felt harder to find with each passing day. She cried after they fell asleep, muffling the sound into her pillow so they would not wake to find her broken too. There were nights she wanted to give up entirely, to let the grief swallow her, the way it had swallowed the ground over her husband's grave. It was the sound of the boys breathing beside her, small and steady, that reminded her every single time why she could not. Demby never left. He cooked meals none of them ate at first, sat outside their doors on nights the crying would not stop, and slowly, without ever asking to, became the steady ground beneath a family that had lost its foundation. He taught the boys to breathe when the grief became too big for their small chests. He taught them, later, how to defend themselves, how to read a room, how to survive in a world that had already shown them it could take everything without warning. It took months before the mornings did not begin with tears. It took longer before laughter returned to the house, tentative at first, testing whether it was allowed. The first time Noah laughed again, at something small, a joke Demby made about burnt rice, Elizabeth had to leave the room so they would not see her cry from relief instead of grief. But it did return, slowly, the way grief always loosens if love is patient enough to wait it out. By the time the boys turned 9, the sharp edges of losing their father had softened into something they carried quietly, a permanent ache tucked beneath their intelligence and humor. They grew clever, observant, protective of their mother in ways children should not have to be. They studied everything Demby taught them like it was oxygen, and they never stopped asking questions about the grandfather they had never met. "Why did father never take us to him?" Ethan asked one evening, doing homework at the kitchen table. "Your father had his reasons," Elizabeth said carefully. "Was he ashamed of us?" Micah asked, not looking up from his book, though his voice carried something fragile underneath the words. "Never," Elizabeth said, sharper than she meant to. She softened immediately, cupping his face in her hands. "Never think that. Your father hid you to protect you. His family is complicated, dangerous, in ways you are too young to understand yet. We are 9, Noah pointed out. We understand plenty." Elizabeth exchanged a look with Demby across the kitchen, one of those silent adult conversations children were never meant to translate, but always somehow did. Demby's jaw tightened. "There are things your father discovered before he died," Demby said carefully, "about his siblings, about the company, things that made him believe going home again could put all of you in danger." "Then why did he keep his father's picture?" Noah asked, quieter now. "Because," Elizabeth thought but did not say, "love does not disappear just because it becomes dangerous." The boys did not push further that night, but something had shifted in them, a seed planted that would not stop growing. They began asking Demby questions when their mother was not around, small, careful questions about the Kang family, about the company, about a grandfather with a face they had only seen once in a faded photograph tucked inside their father's old drawer. They were 9 years old, but they were not foolish. They noticed things adults thought children missed. They noticed the tension in Demby's shoulders whenever the name Kang came up in the news. They noticed the way their mother's hands trembled slightly whenever she thought no one was watching, her fingers brushing the edge of an old photograph of a man they never got to call father in front of anyone but themselves. It was Ethan, always the boldest, who found the folder tucked behind a loose panel in their father's old study, a habit he had picked up from Dembe, checking places no one thought to look. Inside were documents, notes, records their father had gathered quietly over years, proof of things happening inside Kang Enterprises that should never have been allowed to happen. Money moved where it should not move, signatures that did not match, names of people who should have been protected and were not. The boys did not fully understand every word, but they understood enough. Enough to know their father had not run away out of weakness. He had run to protect a truth, too dangerous to sit beside quietly. And now, without him there to stop it, the danger was still growing, aimed straight at the one person left who might not survive it, their grandfather. "We have to tell him," Micah said one night. The three of them huddled around a small lamp, the folder spread open between them, like a map to something forbidden. "Tell him what?" Ethan whispered. "That we exist, that father hid us, that people around him are planning something bad." "All of it," Noah said, his young voice unusually steady. "Someone has to warn him before it is too late." "Mother will never allow it," Micah said. "Then we will not ask her," Ethan said, closing the folder carefully. "We will save him ourselves." None of them noticed the shift in the air outside their bedroom door, the pause in footsteps that had stopped just short of the room, listening. Dembe stood frozen in the hallway, his hand hovering over the doorframe, his chest tight with a decision he was not sure he had the right to make. He had sworn to protect them. He had never sworn to stop them from becoming exactly the kind of people their father had raised them to be. The next morning, the household woke to whispers of an event splashed quietly across the financial pages, a private gathering scheduled at the Kang estate, closed to media, closed to outsiders, the kind of gathering that only happened for one reason among families like theirs: a will reading. Elizabeth read the headline over her coffee, her hand freezing halfway to her lips. Dembe stood across the kitchen, watching her carefully, waiting. "He is planning to divide everything already," she said quietly, disbelief coloring her voice. "He is still alive. Why now?" "Perhaps he feels time slipping," Dembe said. "Perhaps he wants peace settled before it is too late to settle it." Elizabeth set the paper down, her fingers trembling slightly against the table. "Will you go?" she asked, not looking at him. "If I decide to." Dembe crossed the kitchen slowly, kneeling slightly to meet her eyes. "I will stand beside you until my last breath, Elizabeth." "Whatever you decide." She did not answer right away. Upstairs, unheard, three small figures pressed against the top of the staircase, listening to every word, their eyes wide with a plan already forming, one their mother knew nothing about, one that would carry them straight into the heart of a family fortress none of them had ever set foot inside. By the time Elizabeth made her decision that evening, gathering her courage slowly like pieces of broken glass, she had no idea her sons had already made theirs. That night, sleep refused to come for any of them. Elizabeth lay awake staring at the ceiling, rehearsing words she might say to a man who had never once tried to find her. While 3 floors of silence away, her sons lay awake as well, whispering through the dark about codes, gates, and a promise their father once made them repeat until they had it memorized, without understanding why. The next morning, 3 backpacks sat suspiciously heavy by the front door. 3 boys ate their breakfast in unusual silence, exchanging glances that held entire conversations without a single word spoken aloud. Elizabeth kissed their foreheads before school, unaware that the folder from their father's study now rested carefully inside Ethan's bag, unaware that a master code whispered to them years ago in a half-asleep bedtime conversation was about to be used for the first time. "Be good today," she said, straightening Noah's collar. "We always are," Noah said, smiling in a way that should have worried her far more than it did. The moment the school gates closed behind their mother's car, the 3 boys did not walk toward their classroom. They lingered near the fence, counting the minutes until the teacher on duty turned her back, and then they slipped through a gap they had scouted for nearly a week, 3 small shadows disappearing before anyone thought to look twice. They walked 2 streets over, to where a taxi driver they had befriended weeks earlier during a school trip waited exactly as promised. An old man who thought he was doing 3 polite boys a favor by driving them to their uncle's house. He had no idea what address he had actually been given, no idea what waited at the end of the long gated driveway lined with trees older than the company itself. Inside the taxi, Micah unfolded the faded photograph one more time, tracing the edges with his thumb, the way his mother often did without realizing. Ethan checked the folder in his bag for the 5th time. Noah simply stared out the window, watching the city grow taller and colder the closer they came to the address memorized from a picture their father once showed them. His voice tight, his eyes far away, saying only that this was where every important thing happened. None of them spoke for the last 10 minutes of the drive. The silence was not fear. It was the particular quiet of children who understood, without needing to say it aloud, that once they walked through those gates, nothing in their lives would ever be simple again. The taxi slowed in front of iron gates taller than any fence they had ever seen, security cameras perched like watching birds along the stone walls. Ethan leaned forward and recited the numbers Demby had once mentioned in passing, numbers he claimed their father had given him for emergencies only, numbers none of them had ever expected to use so soon. The gate light blinked red, then, impossibly, green. Inside the mansion, in a room filled with lawyers, cold coffee, and 3 adult children, waiting to hear how much of their father's empire would finally belong to them, Chairman Kang Sung-ho sat at the head of a long table, pen hovering over a document that would seal decisions 2 decades in the making. He had no idea that the sons of the child he had lost were minutes away from bursting through his doors, carrying a warning that would break his heart before it saved it. The pen touched paper. Somewhere deep in the mansion, a side door unlocked itself with a soft click that no guard noticed in time. The door did not creak. It simply opened, the way doors open in dreams, too easily, too quietly, and 3 small figures stepped into a room built for grown men deciding the fate of billions. "Grandpa, don't sign it," Ethan shouted, his voice cracking through the silence like a stone through glass. Every head at the long table turned at once. Lawyers half rose from their seats. A security guard near the entrance froze mid-step, his radio crackling uselessly in his hand, as if even the walls of the mansion had chosen, just this once, to let something through. Chairman Kang Sung-ho sat perfectly still, the pen resting against paper, ink bleeding faintly into a signature he had not yet finished. He did not move for a long moment, his eyes narrowing at the 3 boys standing shoulder to shoulder in the doorway, their school uniforms slightly wrinkled, their chins lifted with a defiance that did not belong to children who had wandered in by accident. "Who let them in?" he said, his voice low, dangerous, the voice of a man who had built an empire on the ashes of never being surprised. Nobody answered, because nobody knew. "Who are you?" he asked instead, addressing the boys directly now, his gaze moving from one identical face to the next, searching for something he could not yet name. "We are your grandsons," Ethan said, his small voice steady, despite the room full of strangers staring at him. The words landed like a struck bell, the sound of them ringing long after they were spoken. Somewhere near the far end of the table, a woman gasped audibly, her hand flying to her chest, her chair scraping backward as she instinctively shrank away from the announcement, as though it might explode. "Grandsons," Chairman Kang repeated, the word foreign in his mouth. "I have no grandsons." "You do," Micah said quietly, stepping forward. "You just never knew about us." "How did you get in here?" a man near the chairman demanded, older, sharp-featured, one of the sons still waiting to hear how much of the will belonged to him. "This is a private matter." "Security. Father gave us the code," Noah said simply, as if that explained everything, as if a 9-year-old boy speaking about a dead man in the present tense was the most ordinary thing in the world. "Father?" Chairman Kang's voice broke on the word, the first crack in a composure built over decades of never letting anyone see him falter. He rose slowly from his chair, one hand pressed flat against the table as though he needed it to remain upright. "Whose father?" "Kang Jae-min," Ethan said. "Our father, your son." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, heavy, the kind of silence that presses against the chest and makes breathing difficult. Chairman Kang stared at the three boys, as though seeing a ghost split into three separate pieces, each one wearing his son's eyes, his son's stubborn jaw, softened by skin the color of warm earth, and hair that curled in ways his own families never had. Behind the boys, near the edge of the room, a woman in an expensive dress had gone pale, ducking slightly behind her own bodyguard, as though the boys themselves might be dangerous. She was the chairman's only daughter, spoiled by decades of privilege, and her wide-eyed retreat behind a man twice her size, for children barely reaching her waist, would have been almost comical if the room had not been suffocating under the weight of what was unfolding. "That is impossible," said the second son, standing now, his face flushed with something between disbelief and fear. "Jae-min cut ties with us for years. He would have told someone. He would have told me." "He told no one," Noah said, "because he did not trust any of you." The words cut sharper than a 9-year-old should have been capable of delivering, and yet nobody in the room argued the point. Chairman Kang lifted a hand, silencing the rising voices around him, without even looking at them. His eyes had not left the boys since they entered. "Everyone out," he said quietly. "Father, surely we should be part of this," the eldest son began. "Out," Chairman Kang said again, louder this time, the authority in his voice unmistakable, the kind of command that decades of obedience had trained an entire company to follow instantly. Lawyers gathered papers with shaking hands. His children filed out reluctantly, throwing glances at the three small boys who had just detonated a truth none of them had seen coming. Once the room emptied, Chairman Kang gestured toward a smaller door at the back, one that led to a private study, thick-walled, soundproofed, the kind of room built for conversations that were never meant to leave it. "Come," he said, his voice gentler now, though it still trembled slightly. The boys followed him inside, Ethan clutching the strap of his backpack, Micah watching every corner of the room the way Demby had taught him, Noah walking closest to his brothers, his small hand brushing against Ethan's sleeve without quite holding it. The chairman closed the door behind them and turned, studying their faces again in the softer light, as if searching for proof he had not imagined the entire scene. "You have his eyes," he said quietly, "all three of you." "Mother says we have his stubbornness too," Micah said. Something shifted in the old man's face, the ghost of a smile that vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced almost immediately by grief pulling the corners of his mouth downward. "Where is he?" he asked. "Your father. Why did he send children instead of coming himself?" Nobody moved for a long moment. It was Ethan who finally spoke, his voice quiet now, stripped of the boldness that had carried him through the door minutes earlier. "He died," Ethan said, 5 years ago." The old man did not speak. He did not move. For a moment, it seemed as though the words had not reached him at all, as though his mind had simply refused delivery of something too heavy to carry. Then, slowly, his legs gave slightly, and he lowered himself into the nearest chair, one hand pressed against his chest, his breath coming shallow and uneven. 5 years, he repeated, almost to himself. "He has been gone 5 years, and I did not know. I did not know my own son was dead." A single tear slipped down his face before he could stop it, sliding into the deep lines carved by decades of never allowing himself this exact moment. He wiped it away roughly, ashamed, though none of the boys looked away. "Why?" he said, his voice hardening suddenly, turning toward the boys with something between anguish and anger. "Why would he keep you from me? Why would he let me believe he simply wanted nothing to do with this family, when the truth was he had children, my grandsons, and never once let me know they existed?" "Because he did not trust your children," Ethan said, opening his backpack now, pulling out the worn folder they had carried since that morning. "He found things, before he died, things happening inside the company that he believed put all of us in danger if anyone learned we existed." He placed the folder on the desk, in front of his grandfather, his small hands steady, despite the enormity of what he was doing. Chairman Kang opened it slowly, his eyes moving over documents that made his jaw tighten with every page, signatures forged, money diverted, names of employees who had vanished quietly from records after asking too many questions. His hands began to shake, not from grief now, but from a fury that had been building silently for years without a clear target, until now. "Who?" he said, his voice low, dangerous. "Which one of them?" "We do not know all of it," Micah admitted, "but we know enough to know it was not father. He was trying to stop it. That is why he left. That is why he hid us." Chairman Kang closed the folder with a sharp motion, rising from his chair so fast it nearly toppled backward. Without another word, he strode toward a locked drawer in his desk, retrieving a small pistol he had not touched in years, his movements mechanical, driven by something far past reason. "Grandpa," Noah said, alarmed, stepping forward. The old man did not answer. He walked out onto the wide balcony overlooking the estate grounds, the wind pulling at his silver hair, his hand gripping the weapon so tightly his knuckles turned white. Below, the garden stretched out in perfect symmetry, hedges trimmed to precision, a family fortune built on soil that had apparently grown poison beneath its roots, without him noticing. He raised the gun slightly, aiming at nothing, at everything, at the family he had spent decades building and failed to protect, at himself for not seeing what had been happening under his own roof. His hand trembled violently. The boys had followed him out, standing a careful distance away, watching a grown man come undone in a way none of them had words for. "I did this," he said, his voice breaking completely now. "I built this family on ambition and silence, and I taught them all that love was something you earned through obedience. I drove my own son away with the same coldness my father used on me, and now he is gone, and I never even had the chance to tell him I was wrong." His arm lowered slowly, the gun slipping from his fingers, clattering against the stone floor of the balcony. He sank to his knees, his shoulders shaking, an old, powerful man collapsing under the weight of grief he had refused to let anyone witness for years. Ethan moved first, crossing the distance between them and placing a small hand on his grandfather's shoulder. Micah knelt beside him on the other side. Noah, hesitant, finally closed the gap and wrapped his small arms around the old man's neck, the way he used to hug his own father before bedtime. "You are not too late," Ethan said quietly. "You are here now. That has to count for something." Chairman Kang lifted his head, his face wet, unguarded, in a way none of his own children had ever seen. "Your mother," he said, "is she well? Did he take care of you both, all of you, before he died?" "He gave us enough," Noah said, "but we miss him every day." "And your mother," the old man pressed, "where is she now?" "At home," Micah said. "She does not know we came here." For the first time since the boys had burst through his door, something that resembled a smile touched the corner of Chairman Kang's mouth. Fragile, uncertain, but real. "She will be very angry," he said. "Very," Ethan confirmed. The old man let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, wiping his face with the back of his hand before rising slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. "Then perhaps," he said, "we should not keep her waiting any longer than necessary." By the time the taxi pulled up outside their home that evening, the sky had turned the deep purple of approaching night, and the porch light was already on, a sign that someone had been standing near that window for hours. The front door opened before Ethan could even knock, revealing Elizabeth's face, tight with fear that had curdled into fury the longer the hours had stretched without word from the school. Behind her, Demby stood with his arms crossed, his expression darker than any of the boys had ever seen it. "Mum, we can explain," Ethan started. "Don't," Elizabeth said, her voice cracking on the single word. She turned and disappeared up the stairs before any of them could see the tears already falling, the sound of a door closing softly behind her, somehow louder than if she had slammed it. Dembe exhaled slowly, looking at the three boys with an expression that mixed relief and disappointment in equal measure. "You have no idea how worried she was," he said. "The school called at noon. Nobody knew where you had gone. She thought, for hours, that something terrible had happened to you." "Something almost did," Micah muttered, thinking of the gun on the balcony, though he did not say it aloud. "Go to bed," Demby said, his voice gentler now, though still firm. "We will speak with her in the morning, when she is ready." None of them slept well that night. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying his grandfather's collapse on the balcony over and over. Micah kept thinking of the folder, of names he did not fully understand, but knew meant danger for someone. Noah cried quietly into his pillow, not from fear of punishment, but from the aching image of an old man kneeling on stone, broken by grief he had carried alone for years. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, the boys knelt outside their mother's bedroom door, 3 small figures in matching pajamas, waiting in silence until they heard movement inside. When the door finally opened, Elizabeth found them kneeling there, heads bowed, an image so unexpected that her anger faltered before she could stop it. "We are sorry," Ethan said, not lifting his head. "We should have told you. We were scared you would say no, and we could not let something happen to him without warning him first." "Get up," Elizabeth said softly, though her voice still trembled. "Please, get up." They rose slowly, watching her face for any sign of what she was feeling. She studied each of them in turn, checking for injuries, for anything that might have gone wrong that she had not yet been told about, before finally pulling all 3 into an embrace so tight it nearly lifted Noah off his feet. "Do not ever disappear like that again," she whispered into their hair. "I do not think my heart could survive it a second time." "We accept," Micah said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Accept what?" she asked, pulling back slightly. The boys exchanged a glance, the kind that always preceded news they were not sure how to deliver gently. "Grandpa wants to see you," Noah said. Elizabeth went completely still. "What?" she said, the word barely audible. "He knows about us now," Ethan said carefully. "He knows father is gone. He wants to meet you. He asked us this morning, before we left, if you would come." Elizabeth sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, her hands pressed against her knees, her mind racing through years of imagining this exact moment and never once believing it would actually arrive. She thought of Jae-min's voice, quiet in the dark, insisting his father was a good man beneath the coldness. She thought of the years spent protecting her sons from a family she had never trusted, and the years spent quietly hoping, despite everything, that trust might one day be possible. "I do not know if I can face him," she admitted. "He cried," Noah said softly. "When he found out father died, he cried in front of us, Mum. He is not the man father described to us as scary. He is just sad." Elizabeth closed her eyes, breathing slowly, steadying herself the way she had learned to do in the years since burying her husband. When she opened them again, there was something resolved in her expression, something that had chosen, finally, to stop running. "Then I suppose," she said quietly, "it is time we met him properly." The meeting took place 3 days later, in a garden behind the Kang estate, chosen deliberately by the chairman himself to feel less like a boardroom and more like the kind of place a family might actually gather. Elizabeth arrived with Demby, walking a careful step behind her, the boys trailing ahead, already comfortable in a place that had terrified their mother for years. Chairman Kang stood near a wooden bench, dressed simply for a man of his standing, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, betraying a nervousness Elizabeth had not expected to see on a face that carried so much authority. "You must be Elizabeth," he said, his voice careful, formal, the words of a man who had rehearsed this greeting and forgotten it the moment it mattered. "I must be," she said, her chin lifted, refusing to let years of imagined confrontations soften into something weaker, now that the moment had finally arrived. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For years my son did not exist to me, not by his choice alone, but because I made it impossible for him to return without losing everything he had built for you and your sons. I am sorry for the years you spent alone. I am sorry I never had the chance to know him as the father he clearly became." Elizabeth studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the coldness Jae-min had once described, and finding instead an old man worn thin by regret. "He loved you," she said finally. "Even when he could not forgive you, he kept your photograph until the day he died." The old man's composure slipped again, briefly, before he forced it back into place. "Then perhaps," he said, "there is still something worth rebuilding." It was not easy after that first meeting. The chairman, uncertain how to behave around children who had grown up entirely without him, bought them mountains of toys within the first week, entire shelves of remote-controlled cars and building sets that none of the boys had asked for, an old man's clumsy attempt to buy back years he could never actually reclaim. "We do not need toys, Grandpa," Micah told him gently one afternoon, surrounded by unopened boxes. "We just want you to talk to us." Embarrassed, the chairman attempted instead to cook for them one evening, insisting the kitchen staff leave him alone with the stove, an experiment that ended in a smoke alarm blaring through the mansion and Noah laughing so hard he had to sit down on the floor. "Grandpa burned water," Ethan announced to the household staff who came running, and even the chairman, standing amid the smoke with a ruined pot in his hands, could not help but laugh at himself for the first time in longer than he could remember. Slowly, the family began to reassemble itself around the boys, who moved through the estate with a fearlessness their uncles and aunt found both baffling and eventually endearing. The eldest uncle, a man whose cold exterior had been carved by decades of trying to earn a father's approval he never received, found himself the target of the boys' favorite prank, waking from an afternoon nap on the study couch to find his nose pinched shut by 3 small fingers, followed by a chorus of giggles disappearing down the hallway before he could catch them. "They will be the death of me," he grumbled to Dembe, though the corner of his mouth betrayed something closer to fondness than irritation. It happened again the following week, and the week after that, until the uncle began pretending to sleep just to give them the satisfaction, secretly enjoying the sound of their laughter more than he would ever admit aloud. The second uncle, quieter, more guarded, softened first through football, discovering by accident that the boys were fiercely passionate about the game, arguing endlessly over which team deserved loyalty, dragging him into backyard matches that left his expensive shoes ruined and his composure entirely undone by the sight of Noah scoring a goal between 2 flower pots and celebrating as though he had won an actual championship. The aunt proved the most difficult to win over, her initial horror at the boys' chaos giving way slowly, reluctantly, to something warmer. It began the day Micah wandered into her dressing room uninvited, watching her apply makeup at her vanity with the solemn concentration of someone studying a masterpiece. "You look beautiful," he said, "but I think the red lipstick suits you more than the pink one." She turned, startled, unused to compliments that did not come wrapped in flattery, meant to extract something from her. "You think so?" she said, unable to fully hide her surprise. "Yes," Micah said simply. "It makes you look like you are not afraid of anything." Something in her chest loosened at the observation, delivered with such plain honesty that she found herself reaching for the red lipstick instead, studying her reflection with new eyes. Later that week, when she walked the runway for a charity show she had quietly modeled for over the years, unbeknownst to most of the family, she wore the red without hesitation, and afterward handed Micah 2 tickets to her next show, admitting it was the best advice anyone had given her about herself in years. Noah burst into the room moments later, having heard about the tickets from Ethan, who had apparently been eavesdropping from the hallway. "Me too," Noah demanded, breathless. "I want tickets too." Ethan appeared right behind him, feigning innocence, though the mischief in his eyes gave him away completely. All 3 boys ended up crowded around their aunt's vanity, giggling over lipstick shades, and for the first time since losing their father, the sound of children laughing in that particular room did not feel like something borrowed. It felt like something earned. It was not all easy. There were arguments, misunderstandings, old wounds that resurfaced without warning, moments when the chairman's temper flared out of habit and had to be gently corrected by 3 small boys, unafraid to call him out on it. There were nights Elizabeth still cried quietly, missing Jae-min fiercely in a house full of people who reminded her of him in fragments, his eyes in Ethan, his stubbornness in Micah, his quiet tenderness in Noah. But slowly, piece by piece, the family that had fractured decades before Jae-min's death began stitching itself back together, imperfect, scarred, but undeniably healing. A year after the will reading that had never actually finished, the entire family gathered at the cemetery on the anniversary of Jae-min's death, standing together at a grave that had once been visited only by a grieving wife, a loyal bodyguard, and 3 small boys, too young to fully understand their loss. Now the grave was surrounded by the family Jae-min had once believed impossible to reunite. Chairman Kang stood at the front, his hand resting on the headstone, his composure steadier now than it had been the day he learned of his son's death, though his eyes still glistened. "You stubborn fool," he said softly, addressing the stone as though his son could hear him. "You could have come home. You could have let me apologize sooner. Instead, you left me to learn everything, from 3 children brave enough to walk through my front door uninvited." Ethan stepped forward, placing a small bouquet of flowers against the base of the stone. "He always said you were impossible to argue with," he said, a small smile tugging at his mouth, despite the tears in his eyes. "Guess that runs in the family." "Who is going to annoy us properly now that you are gone?" Micah added, his voice thick but steady, the kind of grief that had learned, over time, to make room for lightness alongside sorrow. "Nobody argues with Mum the way you did. Nobody teases Grandpa the way you would have. You left behind crackheads just like you," Noah said, laughing despite the tears sliding down his cheeks, gesturing at his brothers and uncles alike. "We promised to take care of them. All of them, even the scary uncles." The eldest uncle, standing nearby, let out a wet laugh, wiping his eyes roughly with his sleeve. "We are not scary," he protested weakly. "You cried during a football match last week," Noah pointed out. "That does not count." Elizabeth stood at the center of it all, watching her sons find laughter even here, at the grave of the man she had loved more fiercely than she ever thought herself capable of loving anyone. Demby stood beside her, steady as always, the promise he made years ago finally, fully honored. "He would be proud," Demby said quietly, watching the boys tease their grandfather about the flowers he had chosen, insisting the color was wrong, that their father had always preferred something brighter. "He would," Elizabeth agreed, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through years of careful grief. "He always said family was worth fighting for, even the parts that seemed impossible to save." The visit ended not with silence, but with laughter carried on the wind, the sound of a family finally whole, standing over the grave of the man who had made it all possible, even from beyond it. Weeks later, on an ordinary afternoon that had become anything but ordinary since the boys entered the family's life, the eldest uncle found himself on the floor of the estate gym, attempting push-ups, while Ethan and Noah lay stretched across his back, giggling and refusing to move despite his groaning protests. "You two are heavier than you look," he grunted, sweat dripping from his forehead as he struggled through another repetition. "That is what happens when you skip leg day," Ethan said solemnly, earning a bark of laughter from his uncle despite the strain in his arms. Down the hallway, in a room filled with soft light and the scent of perfume, Micah sat cross-legged on the floor of his aunt's dressing room, watching her apply the same red lipstick he had once recommended, now a permanent fixture in her routine. "You are getting good at this," she told him, handing him a small mirror to inspect her finished look. "I have excellent taste," Micah said, grinning. "Father always said so." She smiled, softer now than she had ever allowed herself to be in front of anyone, and reached for a second set of tickets tucked into her vanity drawer. "For the next show," she said, "bring your brothers this time, all of them." As if summoned by the mention, Noah burst through the door moments later, breathless from his workout session with the uncle down the hall, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the tickets already in Micah's hand. "Me too," he declared, exactly as he always did, exactly as his aunt had come to expect and secretly adore. Ethan appeared right behind him, still catching his breath, peering over his brother's shoulder at the tickets with mock seriousness. "Only if I get the good seats," he said. Their aunt laughed, a full, unguarded sound that filled the room and drifted down the hallway, mixing with the distant sound of their uncle still complaining about his aching arms, with the sound of their grandfather somewhere below, attempting, once again, to cook something without triggering the smoke alarm, with the sound of their mother's laughter carrying from the garden where she sat with Dembe, finally, fully at peace. All 3 boys collapsed into giggles together in the doorway, a tangle of arms and laughter and stolen lipstick tubes, 3 small architects of a family reunion nobody believed possible, standing now in the middle of everything they had fought so hard to rebuild. Somewhere beyond all of it, in the quiet corner of a cemetery that no longer felt only like a place of grief, the wind moved gently over a headstone bearing a name that had once meant fear and distance to an entire family, and now meant only one thing: home.